Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, distinguished guests, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you here today for the Sir James Plimsoll Annual Lecture. I would like to acknowledge guests, Senator the Honourable Lisa Singh, Senator for Tasmania, Ms Melissa Connolly-Tyler, National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Mr Luigi Bini, Honorary Consul of the Consulate of Italy, Ms Jenny Ellen Kennedy, Honorary Consul for the Consulate of Norway, Mr Alexios Pittas, Honorary Consul of the Consulate of Greece, Ms Kathleen Plimsoll, Mr Anthony Kanak, Ms Verity Plimsoll-Kanakova and Master Christian Plimsoll-Kanak. As a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania acknowledges the Muhunina people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this campus was built, and pays its respects to elders past and present. At the Patrons' Dinner of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2005, the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Alexander Downer, announced that the Department of Foreign Affairs would sponsor an annual Sir James Plimsoll lecture featuring an Australian or international authority on international relations. It was agreed that UTAS would host the annual event in collaboration with the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. This lecture is part of the university's program of thought leadership, which includes but extends well beyond the exchange of ideas within the academy. We have a deep commitment to stimulate and facilitate the practice of public debate and discussion. Through their inspiring and challenging presentations, those who have delivered the Sir James Plimsoll Annual Lecture have made a significant contribution to the profile of the university as a leader in contemporary thinking on critical matters and have helped to build and enhance relationships within the community and across the globe. Sir James Plimsoll was one of the most distinguished diplomats in the history of Australia's Department of External Affairs, later the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He was educated in New South Wales, receiving bachelor's degrees in economics in 1938 and arts in 1941 from the University of Sydney. After serving in the Australian Imperial Force in the Directorate of Research and Civil Affairs, Sir James was appointed to the Far Eastern Commission, tasked with overseeing the Allied Council for Japan during the occupation of that country. In 1950, he was sent as the Australian representative to the United Nations Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, where he formed a close working relationship with Syngmun Rhee, the South Korean president. Sir James was appointed as Australia's permanent representative to the United Nations in 1959 and became Australia's High Commissioner to India and Ambassador to Nepal in 1962. He was chosen to be head of the Department of External Affairs in 1965. In 1970, Sir James was appointed as Ambassador to the United States, and in 1974 he became Ambassador to the USSR. He was appointed as Ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg and the EEC in 1977, and in 1980 became High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. His final diplomatic post was as Ambassador to Japan in 1981 and 1982. He later served as the highly popular and respected Governor of Tasmania from 1982 until his death in May 1987, only shortly after having his initial 5-year term extended. This extraordinary career may have been very different. In 1947, while based in the USA, he received a letter from the Vice-Chancellor of this university, Torleif Hitton, who was an economic advisor to the Bank of New South Wales, advising of a vacancy for the position of Professor of Economics at the University of Tasmania. Hitton encouraged Sir James to apply, which he did. He was not successful. how wrong did the university get it? Appointments processes were not perfect then and not always perfect now, but we do our best. He was not successful, but I think probably to the country's gain. Instead, he quickly became a First Secretary in the Department of External Affairs. When he was Governor of Tasmania, Sir James developed a great interest in the university. He liked, for example, occasionally to come unannounced to the bookshop where he browsed. And he was awarded an honorary degree in early 1987, not long before he died. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce James Plimsoll, State Director for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Tasmanian Office, to welcome our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2013 Sir James Plimsoll Lecture. It is my great privilege to introduce this year's speaker on behalf of the University of Tasmania, the Tasmania branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Few Australians at this point could be better qualified to speak in honour of Sir James Plimsoll than Peter Varghese. As Australia's High Commissioner to India from 2009 to 2012, and now as Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, a position he's held for almost 1 year, Mr Varghese has followed quite directly in the eminent footsteps of Sir James, making an equally distinguished contribution to Australia's international interests. Mr Varghese has also served as an Australian diplomat in Vienna, Tokyo and Washington, and as High Commissioner in Malaysia. In Canberra, he has held the position of Director General of the Office of National Assessments from 2004 to 2009, and has served as a Senior Advisor on international issues to the Prime Minister and in a range of senior positions within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In 2010, he was appointed an Officer in the Order of Australia for distinguished service to public administration, particularly in leading reform in the Australian intelligence community and as an advisor in the areas of foreign policy and international security. Mr Varghese brings to tonight's topic, the challenges of multilateralism, a perspective shaped by this breadth of experience at the coalface of Australian foreign and trade policy. Since the inception of the Plimsoll Lecture Series, we have worked with the University of Tasmania and the Australian Institute of International Affairs to present senior international figures, diplomats, commentators and academic specialists in world affairs to a Tasmanian audience. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Australia's most senior diplomat. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr Peter Varghese.
Well, good evening to all of you, and thank you for coming on a rather chilly Tasmanian evening. Anita, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the work that you and the office do representing the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Tasmania, a state which has had a long history of international engagement, but which is ramping that up quite significantly at the moment. I'd like to acknowledge Professor David Rich, the Provost of the University of Tasmania, and to thank the University for the invitation extended to me this evening. Can I also acknowledge Emeritus Professor Peter Boyce in his capacity as Tasmanian President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, to other distinguished guests here this evening, and can I extend a very special acknowledgement to the members of the Plimsoll family that are joining us here this evening. For me, it's a great privilege to deliver the Sir James Plimsoll Lecture in memory of one of Australia's most eminent diplomats and, of course, a highly respected Governor of Tasmania. As you've heard, Sir James was a predecessor of mine as Secretary of the Department, and I'm honoured to be the first among his successors to deliver this lecture. I never met James Plimsoll. He had retired shortly after I joined the department, but every Australian diplomat of my generation knows of him. His was not just a fine policy mind, but he also possessed in large abundance that most important attribute for a diplomat in the field, the capacity quickly to win the trust of others. People confided in Plim. He had that effect on all those he met. Plimsoll was not only a predecessor of mine in Canberra, but as Anita has mentioned, also in New Delhi. Both of us, in fact, were appointed secretary from the position of High Commissioner to India. And each morning, as I walked up the stairs of the Australian High Commission to my office, I would pass his black and white photograph on the wall, a face which conveyed quiet confidence, a touch of mischief, and a wide openness. The topic of my speech tonight, the challenges of multilateralism, may sound somewhat obtuse to a wider audience. The idea of multilateralism is not, after all, something commonly discussed in the broader community. It's a word that daily echoes the quiet spaces of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and of course is commonly used in broader foreign policy circles, but it's a slippery, uncommon word on the outside. And yet it is vitally important for Australia and the global community. It is in many ways the way we make our world. Indeed, in a broader context, it is almost the only way we can deliberately make our world. That statement is particularly true for Australia, even more so than for many other states, because we belong to no natural geopolitical or cultural grouping like the European Union or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Australia cannot bully or buy its place in the world. An international rules-based order is therefore in our best interests, and an effective multilateral system is the surest way to get there. Multilateralism is not an end in itself, nor is it an alternative to bilateral relationships. Indeed, the two go hand in hand. The stronger our bilateral relationships, the better our chances of securing multilateral outcomes. Both are anchored in our national interests. Bilateral relationships are and will remain the core of our diplomatic statecraft. They are where our efforts to protect and advance Australia's national interests start and often finish. But foreign policy is more than the sum of our bilateral relationships. We do not live in a world of only two players. Our external environment is shaped and driven by the actions, needs, and interests of nearly 200 nation-states, and indeed non-government and major corporate institutions that make up our world. Multilateralism is the practice by which we democratize the rules and norms of international behavior, the process by which we weigh and value the interests and perspectives of all of our partners, even as we pursue our own national interests. The UN in particular holds a special place. True, its record after 70 years is mixed. Its political posturing can be frustrating. Its inability to agree on decisive action can be annoying. But for all its flaws, the UN does possess a unique legitimacy, and it has played a pivotal role on issues such as decolonisation, which reshaped the geopolitical map of the second half of the 20th century. The truth is, if we did not today have the United Nations, we would have to invent it, warts and all. Before globalisation, multilateralism probably didn't matter too much. In the age of empires, the fate of the empire was the central concern. One might ally with another, particularly in joint defence against a third, but there was little sense of a global common good, of national interests that were also international interests. Operating effectively in multilateral institutions is an art, and James Plimsoll took to it quickly. At the end of 1945, as Major Plimsoll of the Australian Army, with no previous diplomatic experience, he was thrown in the deep end as a delegate on the inaugural meeting of the Far Eastern Commission in Washington, under the critical eye of Australia's then Foreign Minister, Dr. H.V. Evatt. Evatt, impressed by Plimsoll, made him Australian representative on the FEC for 2 years before he joined the department and went on to serve in the Australian mission in New York. There, Plimsoll adapted quickly to what was the new multilateral system. He developed a deep understanding of how to advance Australia's interests in what was a newly emerging form of diplomacy, one in which outcomes could be achieved by working with a range of partners, taking account of different interests and perspectives, looking around corners as much as looking straight into eyes. 2 anecdotes show his quality. While he was working in New York in 1948 to 1950, Korea became the first hot exchange of the Cold War. In the still brand new United Nations, then and now the institutional foundation stone of our multilateral system, Plimsoll worked closely alongside an American delegate, some 30 years his senior, John Foster Dulles, co-drafting resolutions on Korea. Later in his career, when Dulles was US Secretary of State and Richard Casey was Australia's Foreign Minister, Casey was greatly impressed to hear Dulles address Plimsoll by his first name. After the North attacked over the 38th parallel in 1950, UN forces led by the Americans were deployed on the peninsula with initial success. The international community established UNKIRK, the UN Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, anticipating an early end to the war. China's intervention, of course, ended that hope. Then only 33, Plimsoll was chosen as Australia's representative on UNKIRK, with the rank of ambassador. Although the other delegates were all much older than Plimsoll, he had a critical background many of his colleagues didn't: years of experience in the United Nations in dealing with Korea. The first meeting of the Committee on Korean Soil was not an auspicious one. In Seoul, it was held by candlelight. The fighting was so close, critical power infrastructure had been knocked out, and the lights had failed. For most of the UNKIRK delegates, the first best thing to do was to immediately relocate the committee somewhere outside of Seoul, preferably across the Sea of Japan. Courage is not always the most practiced of diplomatic arts. But Plimsoll knew he had to hold the nerve of the delegates to keep the committee seated in Korea. UNKIRK might need to leave Seoul, but retreat from Korea would have looked bad. He argued to stay put. He didn't just talk to the other delegates in the room, he cabled Canberra and got a message to Washington. These 2 capitals persuaded the other member states on the committee to stay put. He won the argument, and the delegates stayed on in a war-frayed Seoul to try to find a way forward. After his time in Korea, Plimsoll had 6.5 years in Canberra, often acting as secretary when Arthur Tang was away. He worked closely with Casey and got to know Menzies, who for a couple of years was Foreign Minister as well as Prime Minister. Plimsoll felt he knew Menzies' mind, and Menzies had great respect for Plimsoll, who became permanent representative in New York at the age of 42. On one occasion, in 1962, when the issue of Rhodesia was coming up for the first time in the General Assembly, Plimsoll was trying to get a read from Canberra on how he should proceed. Canberra told him that Menzies was coming through New York and he could consult the Prime Minister directly. But when Menzies arrived, Plimsoll found it very hard to draw him on Rhodesia. Several times he tried to pin the Prime Minister down. Finally, at the end of the visit, when Plimsoll was seeing Menzies onto the plane, he asked him for guidance on Rhodesia. Menzies patted Plimsoll on the back and said, "My boy, I'm glad it's you, not me, making that speech." The multilateral system that Plimsoll helped nurture has generally served the world well. After all, since the Second World War, we have not had another global conflict. We sometimes came close during the Cold War, but diplomacy and our international system has acted as a vital stabilizer along the way. Our international economy has undergone significant reform. Trade has been liberalised. Globalisation and more open markets have proceeded to deliver more prosperity and wealth around the world, particularly since the decolonisation period than ever before. Democracy and the rule of law are much more widespread than they were in the ashes of 1945. Slowly, we have learned how to work together on newly identified problems, such as environmental issues that were not on the radar in the Bretton Woods period. In the Montreal Protocol, the speed with which we were able to negotiate the phase-out of many of the highly damaging chlorofluorocarbons, a human invention that had been damaging the ozone layer since at least the 1950s, showed a more mature world able honestly to grapple with novel issues. Surprisingly, even during the Cold War, we were, as an international community, able to negotiate on a range of issues, even when you might have expected conflicts of interests to prevail. The Antarctic Treaty, an imaginative agreement that not only supports the demilitarization of a unique and pristine environment, but puts aside competing territorial claims to focus on scientific research, it is a fine example of effective multilateralism, and one that is rightly well known in Hobart. Multilateral efforts have helped deliver other significant benefits. Human life expectancy has gone up. In the time since the Second World War, we have developed more effective mechanisms to help the world's poor, systems that have been able to provide some relief during the worst crises faced by the poorest people around the world. We have made significant progress on eradicating diseases, wiping out or reducing to pockets the spread of diseases such as smallpox and polio. And with a sustained push, we are close to doing so with others such as tuberculosis and even malaria. Now, much of the credit for that, of course, lies with national policies that promote economic growth, as well as the advance in medicine and science over those years, particularly the invention of antibiotics and the spread of immunization. But the part of the international system centered around the World Health Organization and the aid programs that have been a feature of the post-war economic restructuring have underpinned and supported scientific progress and have helped get new medicines to the people who have needed them most. The specialized agencies are, in many ways, the success stories of the UN system, practical multilateralism at its best, and in the problem-solving spirit of one of the earliest examples of successful global multilateralism, the 1884 meeting which established the meridian at Greenwich, a vital aid for navigation in the modern world. But today, in 2013, we have a sense that multilateralism is under intense pressure, that the ability of the multilateral system to deliver coordinated results is in decline, that we need the multilateral system more than ever, but it is not delivering on our expectations. Consider trade. The Doha round of trade negotiations is stalled, but even though we cannot at this time see any real hope of a broad general agreement, we need to take the long view. The WTO itself is far from a failure. Its dispute settlement mechanisms allow for countries to find a binding resolution to specific trade disagreements. And we are seeing now approaches to trade liberalization negotiations, even in the absence of a successful Doha round, such as the Trade and Services Agreement currently under negotiation. But the public struggles to hear those messages. The success of the earlier Uruguay round helped create an expectation that the next grand bargain in trade, a vital boost to the global economy, could only be a few years away when negotiations started in Doha in 2001. Consider also security. Unsurprisingly, the pledge made by the international community after World War II through the preamble to the UN Charter was powerfully worded, and I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Now, we've made progress certainly against those eloquent aspirations, and the UN system has played an important role, banning the use of chemical weapons, holding us back from where we could have been in terms of the spread of nuclear weapons. Just this year, with Australia in the chair, we reached agreement on an arms trade treaty, the first multilateral arms control treaty in many years. But why do we still live in a world in which we see what we've seen during the Syrian conflict? The UN was established to defend and support global security, yet still, nearly 70 years after its inception, war and conflict strike time and again around the world. Chemical weapons are still in use, even a century after the horrors of the First World War, and nuclear weapons continue to proliferate, albeit much slower than they would otherwise have done in the absence of a global non-proliferation regime. Reform of the UN itself is as urgent as it ever was, and as far away as any of us can imagine. There is skepticism in the public mind that the international structures we have established can achieve the ends we as an international community identify as critical to our progress. That skepticism extends deeply through the United Nations itself. Our international institutions are perhaps poorly understood, but they're judged even more poorly. What are the pressing issues facing the multilateral system? To start with, of course, we have to admit that it was designed by human hands, but the cracks in our international order are more than just human error. Part of it is a numbers game. The number of participants in the international system has grown dramatically, from 51 members of the United Nations in 1945 to 193 members today, and from 23 members of the World Trade Organization's predecessor organization, the GATT, in 1947, to 159 members of the WTO today. To some degree, the international system is showing its age. Many of our structures were designed in the post-war world, and we just don't live in that world anymore. There have been and continue to be major shifts in the distribution of economic weight and resulting changes in the distribution of strategic power. Significantly, a major new power, China, has joined key global institutions like the World Trade Organization, reflecting its appreciation of the importance of trade liberalization for its exports. But the increased weight of China and other emerging economies in institutions like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank has also brought changes on how these institutions work. The multilateral system is used to giving developing countries differentiated treatment in trade and other negotiations. But how much sense does that make today when we're dealing with developing countries and economies that are in the top 20 world economies? Also, the unprecedented speed of technological progress in our time means we are constantly playing regulatory and legal catch-up. Think about the extent to which the cyber world creates new regulatory challenges. On that front, Australia has recently led a successful effort to establish that international law applies to state behaviour in cyberspace, chairing a UN group of governmental experts on the subject, or the legal framework around bioethical issues like genetic manipulation or selection. We're constantly struggling to keep up with a rapidly evolving social and technological environment. Why would we assume our international order be spared the same challenges? Driven by our interdependence, the complexity and workload of multilateral institutions has changed dramatically too. In 1909, there were 37 international organizations. By 2000, the number had exceeded 7,000. There are good multilateral institutions and those that are not so effective. Some that are ineffective can be explained as having a mismatch between power and participation. In other words, you can have an institution with many active and engaged participants, but the actual power they have to effect change might be a very different calculus. This goes to the heart of a basic tension in global multilateralism, the mismatch between national power and global democracy. Global multilateralism rests on the equality of states, but power resides with the handful of states with the strategic and economic reach to shape events. The story of multilateralism is the constant quest to expand the reach of the former and constrain the raw power of the latter. It works best when states with power accept that their broader interests are served by a system of international rules and norms which apply to all. That is the perspective Australia has sought to bring to our current term on the UN Security Council, the only institution with the authority to authorise the use of force in dealing with threats to international peace and security. The Security Council can be seen as an attempt to reconcile the tension between power and participation. Its core is the P5, which have the power of veto and the privilege of permanent membership, but it also includes 10 non-permanent members serving 2-year terms. The current multilateral system is largely an invention of the United States and a clutch of Western European countries. But this too is changing and changing dramatically. The emergence of new powers in a multilateral world, the increasing pace of globalization, the influence of non-state actors, and the massive wealth transfer from west to east have altered the dynamics fundamentally. Emerging powers are no longer willing to accept outcomes which they perceive do not take their interests sufficiently into account. Some do not share the core values and interests of Australia and other Western countries. Some favour state sovereignty over individual rights, and so are wary of interventions in national affairs. Some favour a greater role for the state and have shown little interest in taking a leadership role on the global stage. The multilateral system's ability to deliver coordinated results is in decline, as effective action no longer rests in the hands of a few relatively like-minded states, but requires cooperation from an increasingly diverse and more competitive group of states. The increasing influence and activity of China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and a number of other players like South Korea, Egypt, Turkey, Chile, Mexico, and Indonesia will continue to tilt this balance of power. The United States, too, is adapting its approach. Historically, the US saw broad-based multilateralism and the edifice of global public goods as squarely in its national interest. This was unusual, to say the least. There is no historical precedent for a global hegemon to define its interests as best served by a system of multilateral rules underpinned by the ideal of global public goods. For a country like Australia, the post-war world would have looked very different and much for the worse if the US definition of its interests had been more narrowly framed. But while the United States is still deeply committed to the international order, it is also increasingly attracted to the benefit of smaller arrangements that are not necessarily universal in nature, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The intellectual, legal, and normative assumptions underpinning established practices and principles in the international system are under challenge. It is not just the shifting power dynamics that are causing the multilateral system to struggle. The complexity of the issues we face and the sweep of the impacts of globalization are major factors. Governments are expected to manage not only traditional security issues, but a whole range of economic and transnational issues, climate change, pandemics, natural disasters, migration and refugees, food and water constraints, global financial turbulence, currency manipulation, and so on. For many of these issues, anything other than a global approach will not be effective. What are we to do in the face of the stresses we can see on our international order and the institutions of multilateralism? We might well ask what Sir James Plimsoll would have done. Reform is always difficult, particularly when the perspectives around the world on our multilateral institutions are so divergent. But we have seen progress in recent years, the lightning-quick evolution of the G20 into a leaders' meeting in the wake of the global financial crisis, and its status now as the premier institution of global economic reform, replacing the G8, shows we are able to respond to changes I've identified tonight. The growing economic weight of China is already being reflected in the international financial institutions. Over the course of years and decades, reform is possible. Reform of the UN is hard to envisage, but other structures have and are emerging to help us deal with security and economic challenges, like the East Asia Summit, the critical institution in these areas for our own region. Perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that our system is imperfect and thus always subject to change and evolution. The grand bargains of earlier decades, like the Uruguay Round and the WTO, like the Montreal Protocol, and with its limitations, the Kyoto Protocol, may not be a model that we can always emulate, even with our most pressing global issues. The way in which the stalemate in the WTO has driven trade liberalization significantly into the territory of bilateral, regional, and sector-specific reform may well be a model we can apply to other contexts. The Trade in Services Agreement, with current membership, could cover more than 70% of global trade, worth US $3.3 trillion a year. Significantly, it is designed to not only deliver services liberalization to existing members, but also potentially to set the standard for a future WTO negotiation. The Trans-Pacific Partnership offers another model. It is a regional rather than a global negotiation, but still a system that relies on countries which see the benefits of ambition banding together and allows other entrants to come on board when they're willing. That final point is critical. We don't want to see the emergence of exclusive blocs. Rather, we want the benefit of progress to be available to all countries, such that even those not involved at the start of a negotiation can ultimately sign on. Climate change is a global problem, but its solution may not be a grand bargain, including all countries. We should also look at alternatives that have more scope to deliver actual emission reductions. For example, a greater focus on practical mitigation initiatives and the legislative and regulatory frameworks in the countries that are the greatest polluters. Here is another paradox of multilateralism. Unilateral steps can often have large multilateral consequences. We all, for example, want a global agreement on climate change, and we all hope it can be agreed by 2015. But consider this. If the US and China were to take serious unilateral steps significantly to reduce carbon emissions, it would cover something like 40% of global emissions and exert a powerful gravitational pull on what the rest of the world may be willing to do. My point is this: multilateralism is not dead. It is under immense strain, and it is changing its shape and nature. That's what happens under intense heat and pressure. Change in our international order is inevitable, but in trying to find solutions to our most pressing global problems, we have to keep an open mind and be prepared to consider workarounds. The global solutions we find may or may not be global multilateral ones. We have to look at how we engage civil society in the multilateral system, because we are long past the point where the policy positions of governments were the only things that mattered. We have to balance our desire for universality and common agreement with our interest in progress in the company of those nations who share our views and are willing to act. And we have to have a clear view on what the UN system does well and what it does less well. But the art of finding global solutions remains as important as it ever was, a point James Plimsoll will no doubt endorse. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is time for a few questions. I think that just about exhausts the time. I do want to give you my own personal thanks and to invite everyone in the audience to join us for refreshments just outside. And to conclude, I'd like to invite Emeritus Professor Peter Boyce to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Provost, ladies and gentlemen, in thanking Peter Varghese for a very stimulating canvas of the challenges and opportunities confronting multilateralism, he was measured but stimulating, very authoritative, and he very helpfully emphasised that we don't have to choose between multilateralism and bilateralism, which I know has engaged quite a few scholars and foreign policy commentators in the past. But I want to emphasise that, and it may be news to some of our audience, that it is quite uncommon for the permanent head of an Australian policy department to speak publicly, particularly in a widely advertised lecture. It's a very welcome change, but it hasn't always been fashionable in the Australian textbook experience of public administration. I can recall that there was a foreign minister in the 1960s who actually tried to prohibit his senior officers in the Department of Foreign Affairs from speaking publicly. But there was one officer, namely the head of the department, who very successfully resisted this persuasion, and that was none other than Sir James Plimsoll. And I recall a lecture he gave in Tasmania in May 1967. It was an address to the United Nations Association, which he was very happy to deliver. And indeed he told me that he was happy to deliver public lectures anywhere. And I think, as his forthcoming biography will show, this was really part of the substance of Sir James's career experience. I remember the date, incidentally, because he came home to dinner shortly afterwards. But that was, I think, a very appropriate illustration of the value of a senior public servant, especially in the senior ranks of such a sensitive policy department as Foreign Affairs, to be willing to talk publicly. And I believe that with Foreign Affairs being such an important area for public discussion in a country that enjoys its middle-class status, that is to be welcomed. And I can't think of a more appropriate person to have delivered the Sir James Plimsoll lecture tonight than Peter Varghese. And Peter, could you accept this very small, I mean it's physically small, but it's very valuable, as a token of appreciation. Thank you. And I think